Hello all, welcome back. That's JC here. Lecture 5, Part 3. In Part 3 here, we're going to talk a little bit about these revolutionary movements in South America and briefly introduce and discuss three revolutionary leaders in South America, Prince Dom Pedro, Jose de San Martin, and Simón Bolívar. It's important to point out here before we get into talking about Prince Dom Pedro first in Brazil that each of these different individuals are going to lead uprisings in various sections of South America, and they are going to overthrow Portuguese and or Spanish rule. All of these are fought in the age of Napoleon, some during the Napoleonic era, still some a little bit after it. Prince Dom Pedro, we'll talk about here in a minute, will overthrow Portuguese rule in Brazil. Simón Bolívar will help overthrow Spanish rule in the north of South America, more specifically in Venezuela. And Jose de San Martin will overthrow Spanish rule in the south of the continent, especially in Argentina. Each of these revolutionary movements in South America, as we'll see here, all benefited from the turmoil that was the Napoleonic era and the Napoleonic Wars in the European continent. Napoleon is going to invade the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is that peninsula that encompasses the countries of Portugal and Spain. He's going to invade the Iberian Peninsula numerous times. And as a result of that, the Spanish and the Portuguese are largely going to be focusing their efforts on what's going on in the continent, and in some ways not paying attention to what's going on in their colonial possessions in South America. So the Napoleonic Wars there will have a huge impact on these independence movements in South America. So let's go to Portugal and specifically Brazil and talk a little bit about Dom Pedro and how he leads this successful uprising there. We'll start with Dom Pedro. Brazil will be largely impacted by the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon himself by way of Portugal. Now, Napoleon's going to invade the Iberian Peninsula. That's that peninsula in Western Europe that consists of the countries of Spain and Portugal. Napoleon's going to invade on three different occasions. The first major threat comes in 1807, and when it looks like the capital city Lisbon is going to fall, the emperor of Portugal at the time, João VI, or John VI, that's the father of Dom Pedro, he will board a series of British vessels, British ships, and the British were at war with the French and Napoleon at the time, and they will sail him to Brazil, and he'll remain in Brazil until about 1820, 1821. It's important to note here that John VI of Portugal is really among the last that holds on to this idea of absolute power as it relates to emperors. It does. I mean, we talked about Napoleon being imbued with these liberal ideas, the ideas of the Enlightenment. The same thing is going to occur with Dom Pedro. Dom Pedro himself is going to believe in liberal reforms. His daddy, however, doesn't. And once Napoleon's ultimately gone in 1815, by 1820, a series of revolutions will sweep across Europe, looking to end the order of kings. As a result of that, John VI here, João is going to go ahead and go back to Portugal to try to put down this uprising. Thus, when he goes back to Portugal, he's going to leave Dom Pedro in charge in Brazil. Perhaps not the wisest thing to do because his son, Dom Pedro himself, as I mentioned a minute ago, believes in these liberal reforms. He does. So he's got a difference of opinion than his daddy. So it's 1820, 1821 in Brazil. John VI is gone, and for most Brazilians, this is a good thing because they view him as American colonials viewed George III, an overbearing, absolute power-minded boss that didn't have their general health and welfare at top of mind. Dom Pedro different, and he recognizes this as an opportunity for him himself, partly because maybe in some sort of way, Dom Pedro views himself as more Brazilian than he does really Portuguese. And therefore, he sides with the revolutionaries. He does. He brokers a deal with them, and together with the revolutionaries, they put down any loyalist Portuguese forces that are there. And in September of 1822, September 7th to be exact, he declares Brazil's independence from Portugal. And within a couple years, on October the 12th, 1824, he's declared and acclaimed Brazilian emperor. Therefore, the fight for Brazilian independence took a little less than 2 years by best estimates of probably about 22 months. And the independence of Brazil itself came under formal treaty and formal recognition in 1825, and thus began the history of the Empire of Brazil under Dom Pedro I. And the Empire of Brazil, which also encompassed much of what would be the country of Uruguay today as well, that empire will last from 1822 to 1889. Those that are interested in the history of what happens to Brazil itself, the empire of it, I'd ask that you research it further. It's interesting history to be sure. Rolling from Brazil and Prince Dom Pedro, or Dom Pedro I, let's move next to the north of the continent, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, those regions, and talk about the so-styled George Washington of Latin America, Simón Bolívar. Just as Dom Pedro was going to use this peninsular war, that peninsular war is when Napoleon invades the Iberian Peninsula of Portugal and Spain, Simón Bolívar will also use the turmoil of that peninsular war as well to come back to South America and lead revolutionary movements in the north, most specifically in Venezuela. Also, like Dom Pedro, Simón Bolívar is going to be a student of the Enlightenment, of those enlightened ideals and reforms. While he's not going to be the son of an emperor, he does come from a wealthy aristocratic family who has the money and means to send him to university in Europe. So he's going to study in Europe, and it's while he's in Europe that he's exposed to these enlightened ideals. And when Napoleon begins this invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, it's going to cause havoc in Portugal. We already talked about that in Brazil. But it also causes havoc in Spain. And Simón Bolívar himself is going to look to take advantage of the turmoil in Spain, come back to the New World, and lead these revolutionary movements in the north to overthrow Spanish rule. Rather than go into the granular details as it relates to the military campaigns of Simón Bolívar or his person, his biography, and he's a really interesting cat, he is, and pretty wide-reaching too. When I was in Paris last, along the Seine River, there's actually a monument to Simón Bolívar in Paris. Go figure, right? But for those that are interested, I would ask that you research those aspects further. Rather, I want to talk more about the impact of Simón Bolívar and why he gets this moniker of the George Washington of Latin America. The title largely comes from a comparison with Dom Pedro. In the wake of successful revolt in Brazil, Dom Pedro becomes an emperor. Simón Bolívar, however, no. In the north, he pushes for more democratic representative types of governments. Hence the reason he's known as the George Washington of Latin America. He could have been an emperor. He could have likely been a king. But he chose instead to see through these Republican type ideals and try to apply them as best as he saw fit in South America. Important point there. Part of Simón Bolívar's legacy is this military rule in South America, at least in the north. And that's because Simón Bolívar did not believe that representative democracy as applied in places like the United States would work in South America because of the history of South America, because of this triple yoke of ignorance, tyranny, and vice, as he called it. And thus, while he would push for liberal reforms and as much liberty as possible for the people in South America, he also recognized it required a firm hand to maintain control. And it's a legacy we still see continued throughout various South American regimes to present day. It just is. To conclude this part of Lecture 5, I want to pivot now from Dom Pedro I and Simón Bolívar to the south of the country, José de San Martín, and in some ways the western coast of the country, because José de San Martín and Simón Bolívar are going to work in concert with one another to help liberate places like Peru as well. So while I'll focus briefly on his work in Argentina, understand he had a hand to play in the liberation of other countries throughout South America as well, alongside Simón Bolívar. To parallel Dom Pedro and Simón Bolívar, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here at all talking about the campaigns in Venezuela or Peru here associated with José de San Martín or his person. For those interested, I would ask that you go ahead and Google that. Another interesting character here to be sure, to include his later life. I mean, this guy kicks around all over Europe. Pretty cool. And winds up ultimately in Brussels in Belgium. So pretty interesting dude in his own right. Rather, I want to kind of just focus on a few salient points, those that are listed here on this slide. Yes, he's going to lead this successful revolutionary movements in Argentina, Peru. I've already mentioned that. But one of the ways he's going to help this happen is his military training. This is a guy that fought in the Peninsular War against Napoleon. He was a career soldier in the Spanish army. He knows how to do battle, logistics, tactics, strategy. And he knows how to communicate with other leaders, other officers, other egos. And in that regard, it's going to help him establish certain sorts of alliances and be able to work with folks like Simón Bolívar for the greater good. And while José de San Martín is also going to be an individual that believes and embraces these enlightened ideals, this is a guy that really wasn't out to get anything per se himself, other than perhaps to just liberate his native Argentina from Spanish rule. I mean, yeah, he will be eventually named Protector of Peru, but he didn't really want the job. So in that regard, I do find it kind of interesting that we refer to as Simón Bolívar as the Washington of Latin America, when in a way, the guy that really sort of rebuked power, just as Washington would surrender his sword to Congress and say, no, 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 I don't want anything about this power. You want to make me a king? I don't want nothing to do with it. I just want to go back to freaking Mount Vernon. In some ways, José de San Martín was really more hardwired like Washington in that regard. And this just creates a little bit of a curiosity to me that maybe José de San Martín would be better appropriately titled the father of Latin America. So what do we make of the impact of these revolutionary movements in South America? What is the impact of them? While hardly an exhaustive list here, there's a few points I would like to share. First and foremost, once the Spanish and Portuguese left, guess what? They took with them established bureaucratic orders, expansive navies, large underpinning banking and financial institutions. And as a result of that, South American countries had to figure all this out on their own. And if you factor in what we talked about a minute ago, Simón Bolívar's own thoughts, that he didn't think most South Americans were ready for independence, that they needed a strong hand, well, where does that strong hand come from? An individual? A group of individuals? Call it a cartel? Not sure. And in a way, we can still see in South America, in politics, the changing of various regimes in South America, the aftermath of the expulsion of the Spanish and Portuguese to present day. You still can see that. The other important point here is it opens the door. Once the Spain and Portugal are gone, and the French are largely going to be gone too with the Haitian Revolution, who's left then in the Western Hemisphere, at least as it relates to Europeans? Not many. And that's going to give the United States an open door and an open path to perhaps do what? Claim a degree of protectorate, a sphere of influence or control over the entire hemisphere. In fact, we'll turn next to that in Part 4. Dr. JC out, Part 3 here. We'll move on to Part 4 of Lecture 5, the final part of Lecture 5 next.